It is indeed an honor. I am touched to be back here. It feels like a homecoming. Kathy, raise your hand, Kathy. My partner and I attended here from 2003 to 2006 when I was doing my seminary training. And we see so many familiar faces and quite a few new faces, which is, of course, the way of time. But thank you again for having me today. Please accept my words in the spirit in which they are offered. As I tell my congregation, I am merely here to furnish food for thought. Agree or disagree, it is of no matter to me. It seems that everyone loves to tell ministers what's wrong with the church or with religion in general. I thought being a Unitarian Universalist would sort of insulate me from playing that role, and that I would be less likely to be a lightning rod for the religiously disgruntled. Seeing as how our faith tradition somewhat functions as a refugee camp from people that have left other institutional churches. But I was wrong about that. Just like my colleagues, when I'm out in the community and someone discovers that I'm a minister, it's presumed that I'm always ready and willing to lend a listening ear, and that I'll keep smiling and be unfailingly pleasant and accommodating while they tell me about some terrible experience that they've had in the church. Usually a church that bears absolutely no resemblance to the ones that I've served. Now, when I find myself in a conversation with a teacher, I don't start telling them how much I hated high school. And when I'm talking with a lawyer, I don't start criticizing the court system. But with ministers, it seems to kind of go with our territory that we have to function as a sort of doormat so that the muck from the last church experience can be removed. Well, given how ubiquitous this experience is for ministers and how frustrating it can be, I suspected that sooner or later it would erupt into a public controversy. And that day came recently when the Reverend Lillian Daniel vented some of her smoldering resentment in an article in the Huffington Post. Reverend Daniel is a UCC minister, which is a very liberal Christian denomination, also known as Unitarians Considering Christ. And her article caused quite a stir. Here is an excerpt from that article. Quote, "On airplanes, I dread the conversation with the person who finds out that I'm a minister and wants to use our flight time to explain to me that he is spiritual but not religious. Such a person will always share this as if it is some kind of daring insight, unique to him, bold in its rebellion and against the religious status quo. Next thing you know, he's telling me he finds God in the sunsets. These people always find God in the sunsets. And in walks on the beach. Sometimes I think these people never leave the beach or the mountains. What with all the communing with God that they do on the hilltops and the hiking trails, and did I mention the beach at sunset yet? Like people who go to church don't see God in the sunsets. Like we are these monastic little creatures who never leave the church building. How lucky we are to have these geniuses inform us that God is in nature. As if we don't hear that in the Psalms, the creation stories, and everything throughout our deep traditions. Being privately spiritual but not religious just doesn't interest me, says the Reverend Daniels. There is nothing challenging about having deep thoughts all by one's self. What is interesting is doing this work in community, where people might call you on stuff, or heaven forbid, disagree with you. Where life with God gets rich and provocative is when you dig deeply into a tradition that you did not invent all by yourself. Thank you for sharing, spiritual but not religious sunset person. You are now comfortably in the norm for self-centered American culture. Right smack in the bland majority of people who find ancient religions dull, but find themselves uniquely fascinating. Gee, I wish I could take credit for those words. On one level, I have to agree with her. Obviously, her rant comes from a person who is deeply invested in the institutional church, and her denomination in particular. And it would behoove us to hear her words as coming from someone with that agenda. And while her obviously sarcastic comments are really just a little bit of good-natured needling of the spiritual but not religious crowd, actually they were very clever, quite a few people found the tone of those words snarky and undeserving of a minister. Aren't ministers supposed to meet people where they are? Some of her protesters asked. After all, isn't it rather arrogant for churchgoers to suggest non-churchgoers lack spiritual depth? That when someone finds inner meaning in activities outside the church walls, they are being self-indulgent and narcissistic. And that real community is just not possible unless it happens in a church. I'll concede all those points. Yes, it certainly can sound arrogant to say what Reverend Daniels said. And that's why I took serious note of what she said. It took real guts for her to say something that needed saying, even though she was going to get pushback. She was going to be labeled as arrogant for saying it. But if she had made nice when she said it, no one would have noticed. And no one would have gotten motivated enough to respond and to start an online conversation. How can we call ourselves a minister? How can we say that we love others when we meet people where they are, but we fail to challenge them, even when they're probably not going to like it? Even though her words were rather snarky, her point, I think, is somewhat valid. And as I said, on one level, I agree. Spiritual development that happens in isolation is incomplete. Yes, meditation, walking in nature are necessary for our spiritual development, but not sufficient. We need the challenges of religious community for the full realization of our human and spiritual potential. Okay, that's the level on which I agree with Reverend Daniel. On another level, I'm right there with that guy on the plane. There are very good reasons for avoiding churches and finding our own way in the life of the Spirit. After all, today's headlines in our full disclosure society are full of priests and ministers abusing power. And our history is littered with inquisitions, witch hunts, all things fraught in the name of religion. More personally, some of us have had negative childhood experiences of churches being a place of suppression, being told what to think. And there's really nothing more unfriendly to spiritual wonder than heavy-handed religious orthodoxy. I still have nightmares about having to memorize the Westminster Catechism as a young Presbyterian of 13 years old, and facing the frightening possibility that I would have to answer one of those 115 or so questions in front of the congregation. And I had to endure that terror while my very legitimate questions like, where did Cain's wife come from? Or how did Moses write about his own death? All those questions totally ignored. It's not hard at all to realize why fully 1/5 of Americans today identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. And I don't think Reverend Daniel's little article in HuffPo is going to bring them back to the institutional church anytime soon. Being spiritual but not religious might be fashionable right now, but it's really nothing new. The Transcendentalists were saying virtually the same thing in the early part of the 19th century. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the leading Transcendentalist voice, issued a sort of declaration of independence of the Spirit from the religious establishment of his day. In his opening of his essay, Nature, quote, "Why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs. Emerson had trained to be a Unitarian Universalist, a Unitarian minister like his father, and he pastored the Second Unitarian Church in Boston. But he found that role rather stifling, and he left the ministry after 2 years. And he struck out on his own as a lecturer and a writer. And it was in these roles that he found a way to blaze new trails for the life of the Spirit. Emerson found his inspiration in his walks around Walden Pond and the community of friendships that he developed in what was called the Transcendentalist Club. And in his extensive readings of world religions, world literature, the sacred texts of other faith traditions. Emerson and the Transcendentalists looked beyond the Bible and church tradition for their sole sources of religious authority. In their way of thinking and processing, personal experience and intuition were authoritative for the life of the Spirit as well. And Emerson championed the idea of the oversoul, that God is not separate from the world, but that the divine dwells both without and within, and in the natural world. In 1838, Emerson gave the commencement address at Harvard Divinity School. In this speech, which is perhaps his most famous, he outraged the religious establishment of his day by criticizing the preachers of his day as, quote, corpse cold. And he urged these young aspiring ministers instead to look to their own experience of the divine. Quote, yourself a newborn bard of the Holy Ghost, cast behind you all conformity and acquaint yourself at first hand with deity. His most inflammatory comment was his dismissal of the miracles of the Bible and his elevation of nature and life itself as the real miracle. Quote, miracle as pronounced by Christian churches gives a false impression. It is not one with the blowing clover and falling rain. What the Transcendentalists like Emerson were doing was showing us a way to be spiritual that takes us beyond the way outlined by the religiously orthodox. That's where the name Transcendentalism comes from. Transcending or climbing over that rather rigid thinking as it had been delineated for the centuries in the traditional church. Transcendentalism arose because the churches in New England, even the Unitarian ones, were stifling to the Spirit. They were religious but not spiritual. And Transcendentalism issued a corrective to that and brought a breath of fresh air to the religious and cultural thought of that day. No, spiritual but not religious is nothing new. It's been with us for nearly 2 centuries. Whenever I encounter someone that claims that self-identity, spiritual but not religious, I try to make it a point to scratch a little bit below the surface and find out just what this person means by religion. And what I find is mostly they take religion to be all the beliefs, all the accumulated institutional dogma they heard at the last church they attended. And that understanding might be convenient for them, and it might make it easy for them to be dismissive, but that's not what the word means. Religion comes from religios, linking back. It means connecting with the accumulated spiritual wisdom of our forebears. In a sense, it means not having to reinvent every single facet of the entire meaning of life every single generation. There are some things that we can learn from our spiritual forebears without every single one of us having to make it up over and over again as we go. And that's the advantage of being a part of a spiritual tradition, being in religious community, keeping these collections of wisdom teachings. And these are the things we can learn by being in a religious community together. But I can see why being spiritual but not religious is growing in popularity. It's fun to mix a little Zen here and a little yoga there and throw in a little smattering of the Tao and come up with a spirituality that's tailor-made for us and demands very little of us, or at least no more than we want to invest in that particular facet of our life. But I would honestly ask you this morning, is it supposed to be that easy? When we try this and we try that in hopes of finding the perfect match, is it possible that what we're doing is being spiritually promiscuous? Just asking. More and more, it seems to me that being spiritual but not religious is like partying but having trouble holding down your job. Isn't it supposed to require discipline? Isn't it supposed to require us to do things that we really don't want to do, like getting up in the morning and going to work? Parker Palmer, the Quaker writer and teacher, says, quote, "Community is that place where the person you least want to live with always lives." And if that person moves away, there's always arises someone to take his or her place. No matter how much our values and our principles here appeal to you, unless there is a commitment and an investment in the life of this congregation, there will be little or no spiritual growth. I've heard a saying, you aren't a real Unitarian Universalist until you've been really angry or disgusted with your church and stayed anyway. Wow. I think that conveys so well the hard truth of what it takes to be in religious community. Another way that we deprive ourselves when we go our individual ways with our spirituality is that we dissipate our power. When we refuse to be a part of a religious community that shares our values and our vision, we fail to gain our share of the institutional strength that community can give us. When we pursue our individual spiritual paths to the exclusion of involvement in religious community, and we never come together to do the really hard work that building consensus requires, we lose. We never build our communities we never gain that mass effect where we can speak with one voice and be heard. A voice that can be taken seriously out there in the world on issues of local and national concern. And Emerson was trying to right the imbalance of his day by calling out his community in its religious but not spiritual state. But I would ask you this morning, has the pendulum maybe swung too far in the other direction? Maybe we're off balance again. Perhaps we've gone too far in the direction where each of us has our own unique, convenient, personal religion, and we've gotten too far away from our religious communities where people may call us on stuff. People might disagree with us. And I would ask you, was Reverend Daniel maybe doing much the same thing that Emerson did, seeking to bring balance back to our spiritual lives when she called on people to go back to the church? Yes, she received a lot of criticism for what she said. But let us not forget that in his day, Emerson, too, was regarded as totally arrogant in what he said in the Divinity School address. His remarks were also said to be inappropriate for the setting in which he made them. Time redeemed Mr. Emerson. I wonder if time will also redeem Reverend Daniel. Emerson closed out his Divinity School address by saying, quote, "Let me admonish you, first of all, to go alone, to refuse all good models, even those sacred to the imagination of humanity." I substituted a word there. Excuse me. "And dare to love God without mediator or veil." I think we misinterpret what Emerson meant by that when he said refusing good models, when we take that to mean that we can ignore the teachings contained in our great religious traditions. Yes, he was urging us to see the validity and the value of our own experience and not limit us to the models given by others, but he was not advocating that each of us create our own inner life devoid of outside religious authority. Emerson was well versed in the classical teachings of antiquity. Emerson was one of the most dedicated scholars of all time and kept himself constantly immersed in the wisdom and the writings of all the sacred traditions, even as he pursued his own path. And we do him an injustice when we cast him as championing easy, feel-good spirituality. For it to be well with our souls, for us to have a healthy inner life, a balance must be struck. We're called to be spiritual and religious. We are to find sustenance for our inmost being by both personal and spiritual practice and participation in the life of a religious community. Jesus said, "Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them." The first affirmation of Buddhist practice includes both, I take refuge in the Buddha and I take refuge in the Sangha, the community. We are all called on to be a part of something larger than ourselves, to be in spiritual and religious community with one another. May it be so. Amen.